Forward Operating Base, Phuket, Phuoc Tuy Province, 1968. The humidity of the Vietnamese night hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket that pressed against the canvas tents of the American encampment. United States Marine Corps Captain Robert McNamara, a hardened intelligence officer who believed he had seen every horror this war could offer, woke not to the roar of mortars or the scream of sirens, but to a terrifying, silent sensation. It was the unmistakable, icy bite of cold metal pressed firmly against the soft skin of his neck. He opened his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and found himself staring into the face of a nightmare. Standing over him was a man with absolutely no rank insignia, his face painted with charcoal and green mud so skillfully that in the dim, flickering light, he seemed to be a living extension of the jungle itself. A Fairbairn Sykes dagger, the legendary weapon of British commandos from the Second World War, rested against the American officer's carotid artery. The pressure was calculated with surgical precision, just firm enough for McNamara to feel the frantic pulse of his own blood beating against the unforgiving steel, yet not enough to break the skin. The stranger did not utter a single syllable. He simply pressed a calloused finger to his painted lips in a universal gesture of silence, slowly stood up and vanished into the pre-dawn mist as silently as smoke dissipating in a breeze. It was as if he had never been there at all, a phantom born of the humid darkness. McNamara scrambled up from his cot, his hands trembling as he grabbed his M16 rifle which lay a mere 5 feet away, a distance that had just proven to be fatal. A cold wave of sweat drenched his back, soaking his uniform as the realization of what had just happened crashed down upon him. This base was considered an impregnable fortress. United States Marine sentries stood guard at every sector of the perimeter. Armed patrols circulated the grounds every 20 minutes, and powerful floodlights illuminated the fences, turning night into day. How could a living human being have entered undetected, navigated the maze of tents, and placed a blade at the throat of a sleeping captain? 5 minutes later, the captain found his answer, and it was a revelation that shattered his confidence in American military superiority. Australian Major John Curran of the Special Air Service Regiment approached him, looking entirely unperturbed. Curran smirked, lit a cigarette of strong local tobacco that smelled of earth and dried leaves, and remarked casually that while the Americans had decent reflexes, they slept like babies in a cradle. The truth was humiliating. It turned out that 4 Special Forces soldiers had infiltrated the base at 2:30 in the morning. They had bypassed every single guard post, approached 10 different officers' tents, and held knives to the throats of the sleeping Americans. Not a single Marine had woken up until the precise moment of contact with the blade. It was a complete and total failure of one of the most sophisticated security systems in the theater of war. That morning, notes were found on maps documenting the exact times of entry: 2:53, 2:59, 3:04. Everything was recorded with the meticulous scrupulousness of a surgeon noting the time of an incision. But the most terrifying discovery came later, sending a chill through the entire command staff. The Australians had passed 7 roving patrols, 4 stationary posts, and 2 highly trained sentry dogs. Not a single human, nor a single animal, had detected them. Even the dogs, trained to smell fear and aggression, had remained silent. But this was only the first shock in a series of revelations that would rock the Pentagon to its core. McNamara demanded an explanation, his pride wounded and his worldview shaken. Curran answered a question with a question, asking if the Americans even understood what jungle warfare was, or if they were still hoping to defeat the enemy with heavy artillery. The phrase hit like a physical slap in the face. The United States Marine Corps considered itself the elite, comprised of hardened professionals who had seen combat in Korea, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. And here were these Australians, mocking them in their own base. But the facts were stubborn and undeniable. Over 3 years of operations in Indochina, the Australian Special Air Service had lost 17 men while confirming 2,200 enemy eliminations. That is a ratio of 1 to 129. To put that staggering figure into perspective, the average elimination ratio for American infantry units during the same period was approximately 1 to 8. It was a 16-fold difference in efficiency. When these numbers first reached Washington, the Pentagon simply refused to believe them. The reports seemed too incredible. Too much like inflated propaganda designed to bolster morale. The disparity was so vast that it defied the logic of modern warfare as taught at West Point. To verify these impossible claims, they sent a man to Vietnam whom they trusted implicitly, a living legend of military prowess. Military Intelligence Colonel David Hackworth, a man who would eventually earn 91 decorations for bravery and become a symbol of combat excellence, flew in specifically to verify the Australian reports. He expected to find exaggeration. Instead, what he saw forced him to rewrite his own manual on small unit tactics. Hackworth would later write a phrase in his memoirs that military historians still quote with reverence today. He stated that these men fought as if they were already gone, as if they were simply hunting ghosts. He had seen many brave soldiers in his time, but the Australians were something else entirely. They became part of the jungle, and the jungle allowed them to neutralize their targets with impunity. The Americans were reeling from the realization that their massive firepower, their helicopters, and their billions of dollars in technology were being outperformed by small teams of men who moved like shadows. The incident at the base was not just a prank, it was a demonstration of a superior philosophy of war. While American doctrine focused on overwhelming force, the Australian doctrine focused on absolute stealth and patience. They did not just camouflage themselves. They ceased to be foreign invaders and became apex predators of the environment. The ratio of 1 to 129 was not just a statistic. It was a testament to a level of discipline that most soldiers could not even comprehend. But the question remained, how exactly did they achieve such supernatural results? The answer began with something the Americans recoiled from in disgust, something so basic yet so repulsive that it shocked the clean-shaven, well-fed officers of the U.S. Army. It did not start with high-tech gadgets or secret weapons. It started with the smell. In 1966, at the Nui Dat base in Puuaktui Province, American advisors first encountered the training methods of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. A group of 6 Australians was preparing for a 10-day patrol in an area occupied by the 374th Division of the North Vietnamese Army. The Yanks expected to see the usual procedure, checking weapons, tuning radios, packing medicine, and loading crates of standard rations. Instead, 3 days before deployment, the Australians did something unthinkable. They stopped using soap. They stopped using toothpaste. They stopped using deodorant. Furthermore, they rubbed their uniforms with fish sauce, the pungent, fermented condiment used universally by the Vietnamese population. The Americans winced at the stench. The smell was so acrid, so overpowering, that it made some of the advisors physically nauseous. To the hygiene-obsessed American military, this was madness. But the Australians explained patiently that the enemy could smell army soap from 300 meters downwind. They explained that American shampoos and shaving creams smelled stronger than napalm in the humid air of the jungle. The logic was undeniable, yet hard to stomach. The smell of rotting fish was the smell of the jungle. It was safety. It was life. This was the zero-trace doctrine in action. If you want to survive, you must smell like the surroundings, sound like the surroundings, and move like the wind through the leaves. While Americans used chemical mosquito repellents that stung the nostrils, the Australians smeared themselves with river mud. While the Yanks smoked recognizable American brands, the Australians switched to local tobacco dried in the sun by peasants. While American patrols carried canned food in metal tins that clinked with every step, the Australians packed their provisions in cloth bags and ate cold rice with dried fish, the exact same food as their adversary. This dedication to blending in went beyond mere camouflage. One American lieutenant observing the training later admitted to journalists that he realized they were not just disguising themselves as Vietnamese. They were effectively becoming them, just with better training and Australian accents. But the smell was only the tip of the iceberg. The true secret weapon of the Australians was not listed on any army manifest, nor was it something that could be bought with the massive American defense budget. The main trump card was a group of people whom the Americans did not even consider military specialists. These were people whom white Australia had kept as third-class citizens for decades, people whose children could not even attend regular schools. They were the Aborigines. Sergeant Billy Ferguson of the Wiradjuri, Corporal Johnny Morrico of the Yolngu, Private Harry Alinga of the Aranda. These names meant absolutely nothing to U.S. command, but in the dense green hell of the Vietnamese jungle, they meant more than millions of dollars worth of American reconnaissance equipment. Aboriginal trackers had served in the Australian Army since the First World War, and their ability to read the jungle seemed supernatural to the uninitiated. They could determine how many people had passed a trail, exactly when they had passed, where they were headed, whether they carried heavy weapons, if they were wounded, or if they were moving in a hurry. All of this intelligence was gleaned from barely perceptible prints in the mud, broken twigs that no one else would notice, disturbed insects, or minute changes in soil moisture. Captain Terence O'Farrell of Delta Force watched in awe as Billy Ferguson led an Australian patrol through the triple-canopy jungle of Bin Duong Province. The Aborigine moved barefoot, even though army boots were strict regulation. Every 15 to 20 meters, he would stop, freeze for 30 to 40 seconds, listen to the wind, sniff the air, and study the ground like a scholar reading a text. 2 hours into the patrol, Ferguson raised a fist. the silent signal to halt. He pointed ahead into what looked like an impenetrable wall of green vegetation. O'Farrell saw nothing. An Australian lieutenant whispered in the Yank's ear that there was an enemy camp 100 meters ahead. 25 to 30 men. They had stopped for a day break. No fire, but they were boiling rice. The American captain sniffed the air frantically but smelled nothing. Only the scent of rotting vegetation, damp earth, and his own nervous sweat. 20 minutes later, a 105mm battery struck the coordinates. When the smoke cleared, they found 27 bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers, 3 82mm mortars, a radio station, and maps. Ferguson had been right down to the last man. The American captain spent the next 3 days trying to process what he had witnessed. How did the tracker identify the camp from such a distance? The smell of boiling rice in a jungle that smells of rot seemed impossible to isolate. The sound of boiling water from 100 meters away sounded like science fiction. When asked, Ferguson simply shrugged and said that he felt that the earth talked to him. He told the captain that in boots, he was deaf. This moment was a turning point for many American officers who realized that while technology is powerful, there are ancient forms of knowledge that no military academy can teach. There is a connection to the land that no radar can replace. The richest army in the world was losing to people who walked barefoot and read tracks in the dirt. But the trackers were only one element of a complex system. What the Australians did next was something the Americans initially refused to even recognize as a valid tactic. They began to modify their equipment in ways that violated every regulation in the book. They took standard army boots and sliced off the heels and backs, turning them into a kind of tactical sandal. When an American colonel first saw this, he demanded an explanation, claiming that the men were destroying government property and that it was unsafe and unsanitary. The Australian response was brutal in its honesty. A bare foot feels a stretched tripwire in the dark before the eye can see it. A bare foot feels the hardness of a twig before it snaps and gives away a position. A bare foot reads the ground. Standard boots turn a soldier into a blind man. All these methods, the offensive smell, the indigenous trackers, the cut boots, the snail's pace of movement, formed a single, terrifyingly effective system. It was a system the Pentagon refused to acknowledge until they saw the results in action. And then came the moment of proof. Operation Spider, Phuoc Tuy Province, January 1967. A 6-man team under Captain Terry O'Hanlon was tasked with locating the headquarters of the 3rd Regiment of the National Liberation Front. Intelligence reported the headquarters was somewhere near the village of Long Phuoc, but the exact location was unknown. Americans would have simply bombed the village and 3 square kilometers around it, hoping to hit something. The Australians decided otherwise. O'Hanlon's group set out at dawn, moving for 4 days, averaging a mere 3 kilometers a day. On the 5th day, their tracker pointed to a barely visible path intersected by another. The group took up positions 80 meters from the junction, camouflaged themselves, and prepared to wait. They waited for 43 hours. 43 hours without movement. 43 hours without scratching an itch, changing posture, or flicking away an ant crawling across a face. 43 hours of urinating in their pants because moving away meant giving up the position. American officers who were told this story later simply didn't believe it. They claimed human physiology doesn't allow a person to remain motionless that long without muscle atrophy or loss of consciousness. The Australians simply invited them to try it. Lieutenant David Coleman of the 75th Ranger Regiment decided to test himself. He was dropped into the jungle with an Australian team with one task: observe the trail without giving himself away. Coleman lasted 11 hours. Then he had a panic attack, the feeling that he was buried alive, that the jungle was closing in. The Australian sergeant lying next to him didn't even turn his head. He just reached out, found the American's wrist, and squeezed it until the panic passed. Coleman had to be evacuated 20 minutes later. The Australians stayed. They lay there for another 32 hours. At the end of the 2nd day, an enemy patrol passed, 9 men with AK-47 rifles. The Australians didn't flinch. The enemy passed 3 meters from their position and noticed nothing. 4 hours later, a group of porters appeared. One of them relieved himself 2 steps from where the Australian sergeant lay. The spray hit his arm. The sergeant did not move. The porters left. The Australians kept waiting, and then he appeared, a North Vietnamese army officer in a clean uniform. O'Hanlon's group froze. To shoot or not to shoot? 5 targets, 6 shooters, 30 meters distance. But shots would reveal the position. The captain made his decision in 3 seconds. Observation only. 6 hours later, O'Hanlon's group slipped away silently, radioed in, and transmitted the coordinates. 12 hours later, U.S. aircraft struck the headquarters. The 3rd Regiment lost its command, its communications, and its control over the province for 3 months. 43 hours of immobility had destroyed an entire enemy regiment, but this was only one example of dozens. Gradually, it began to dawn on American command that they were dealing with something other than ordinary soldiers. General William Westmoreland personally requested permission to send U.S. officers for training with the Australians. 32 captains and majors underwent a 2-week survival course. 23 of them couldn't take it and asked to go back on the 3rd day. The demands were too high, the discipline too rigid, the risk too great. But what exactly shocked the American officers? First was the level of acceptable losses. Australian doctrine assumed the mission was more important than the life of an individual soldier. If a group was surrounded, retreat was forbidden until the task was complete. If a soldier was wounded and couldn't move, the group left him behind with a weapon and a grenade. No heroic evacuations under fire. The Americans called it cruelty. The Australians called it realism. Better to lose one than all 6. But there was another element, one that hinted at a darker side of this efficiency, a side that bordered on madness. It was the psychological toll. The Australian veterans returned home as people their families didn't recognize. Wives reported that their husbands would wake up in the middle of the night, grab knives, and silently patrol the house. Children were afraid to enter their father's room. Many veterans couldn't sleep in beds. The rate of PTSD among Australian Special Forces soldiers exceeded 80%. For comparison, among U.S. infantry, it was 30 to 40%. A twofold difference. American soldiers fought as soldiers. Australian SAS fought like predators. They became part of a hostile environment, and that environment changed them irreversibly. You cannot live like an animal for weeks and then just return and be human again. Captain Bruce Price spent 4 months in a psychiatric clinic after his 3rd rotation. He couldn't stand the smell of shampoo because it was associated with danger. He couldn't use elevators. He couldn't be in a room with the lights on. Price lived for 32 years after the war, but never returned to a normal life. He settled in the mountains in a house without electricity. When he was found in 2007, it turned out he had passed away 4 days prior. The jungle ghost became a ghost in his own country. There were hundreds like Price. The suicide rate among Special Forces veterans was triple that of regular servicemen. And yet, despite the tragedy, the legacy lived on. The American intelligence services began to copy these methods secretly. When Delta Force was created in 1977, Colonel Charlie Beckwith included Australian instructors. By the early 1980s, these methods became the standard for all elite U.S. units. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, U.S. Special Forces conducted raids hunting for Scud missiles using tactics that were almost a carbon copy of Australian patrols. General Wayne Downing admitted to journalists that everything they learned in Iraq they stole from the Australians in Vietnam. It just took 20 years to realize it and swallow their pride. In 2005, in Afghanistan, a group of 8 Australians engaged 150 Taliban fighters and held out for 9 hours. Losses, 0. Enemy losses, 71 confirmed. Same methods, same results. 40 years later. But let's return to where we started. To the knife at the throat. Captain McNamara lived to be 87. He passed away in 2019. In his final years, whenever the conversation turned to that night operation, he repeated the same phrase. It was the most important lesson of my military career. Not because the Australians proved their superiority, but because they showed me how arrogant I was. That is the true meaning of this story. It is not just about tactics. It is about the willingness to pay a price the Americans were not initially willing to pay. The price of their own humanity. But the real secret to their invisibility began with something far more primal, something that the clean-shaven American officers initially recoiled from in absolute disgust. It all started with the sense of smell in the humid, suffocating atmosphere of Phuoc Thi Province in 1966. When American advisors first arrived at the Australian base at Nui Dat to observe the preparations for a long-range patrol, they expected to see the standard military protocol of cleaning weapons, checking radios, and packing medical kits. Instead, they witnessed a ritual that seemed to border on insanity and gross negligence of hygiene regulations. 3 full days before deployment, the Australian Special Air Service soldiers stopped using soap, they threw away their toothpaste, and they banned all forms of deodorant. The Americans watched in horror as these elite soldiers began to rub their uniforms and their own skin with nuoc mam, the pungent, fermented fish sauce used as a universal condiment by the Vietnamese peasantry. The smell was so acrid, so sharp and rotting that it made several of the visiting U.S. advisors physically nauseous, forcing them to step out of the tent to retch. To the American military mind, obsessed with presentation and sanitation even in a war zone, This was purely barbaric behavior. The Australians explained with a terrifying pragmatism that the enemy could smell Standard Army soap from 300 meters downwind in the dense jungle air. They argued that American shampoos, shaving creams, and chemical insect repellents smelled stronger and more alien to the jungle than napalm. The logic was undeniable, even if it turned the stomach. The zero-trace doctrine was absolute and unforgiving. If you want to survive in the dragon's mouth, you must smell like the dragon, sound like the dragon, and become part of the filth itself. While American units doused themselves in chemical bug sprays that left a metallic tang in the air, the Australians smeared their faces and hands with river mud and charcoal. While the Yanks smoked recognizable brands like Marlboro and Lucky Strike, which left a distinct, sweet trail of tobacco smoke, the Australians switched entirely to harsh, local tobacco dried in the sun by village peasants. They became walking biological hazards to the nose of a Westerner, but to the jungle, they were invisible. But this olfactory camouflage was just the beginning of their transformation into something other than human. The diet was the next casualty of their obsession with stealth. While American patrols carried heavy crates of sea rations packed in metal tins that clinked and rattled with every step, announcing their presence to anyone within a mile, the Australians radically altered their logistics. They packed their provisions in silent cloth bags, carrying only cold rice and dried fish, the exact same miserable diet as their enemy. An American lieutenant, observing this, remarked to a journalist that these men weren't just camouflaging themselves as the Vietnamese. They were becoming them, just with better training, Australian accents, and a terrifying willingness to endure discomfort. Yet, this adherence to the primitive was not a sign of regression. It was a calculated evolution designed to turn the tables on a numerically superior enemy. However, the Australians knew that smelling like the jungle was only half the battle. When the shooting started, they needed firepower that could shatter the silence with overwhelming force. This realization led to one of the most controversial and ingenious adaptations of the entire war, a secret that terrified the enemy and baffled the American allies. It was a weapon that officially did not exist, a weapon born in the unauthorized workshops of the base. Created by men who cared more about survival than the Queen's regulations. They called it, quote, 3. The standard issue rifle for the Australian forces was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, a powerful semi-automatic weapon chambered for the heavy 7.62mm NATO round. It was a reliable beast, accurate and deadly at long range, but in the claustrophobic confines of the bamboo thickets, where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, it had a fatal flaw. It was simply too long. The barrel caught on vines, the length made it slow to swing in a close-quarters ambush, and its semi-automatic nature meant it lacked the volume of fire needed to suppress an ambush. American soldiers had the M16, which was light and fully automatic, but the small 5.56mm round often lacked the punching power to penetrate thick jungle cover. Enter Corporal_quote_4_Miller, a legend among the armorers of the regiment, who decided that the rulebook was more of a suggestion than a law. In the sweltering heat of a corrugated iron workshop, Miller and his fellow engineers began to butcher Her Majesty's rifles. They took the long, elegant barrels of the L1A1 and sawed them off, shortening the weapon drastically. They removed the flash hiders, knowing that the resulting muzzle blast would be enormous, but they didn't care. To handle the recoil of this new Frankenstein's monster, they mounted vertical foregrips taken from XM148 grenade launchers, bolting them directly to the handguards. But the most radical change was internal. Through clever filing and modification of the sear mechanism, they converted these semi-automatic rifles into fully automatic flamethrowers. The result was the Bitch, a compact, heavy-caliber machine that roared like a cannon and spat fire like a dragon. It was loud, it was uncontrollable for a novice, and it was devastatingly effective. The first time an American patrol witnessed the Bitch in action, they thought they were hallucinating. It happened during a joint operation in a sector known as the Iron Triangle, a place where the jungle was so thick it felt like moving through a solid wall. A mixed patrol of U.S. Marines and Australian SAS found themselves walking into a textbook L-shaped ambush. Suddenly, the green wall to their right erupted with the distinctive crack thump of AK-47 fire. Tracers tore through the foliage and the lead American scout went down. The Marines returned fire, but disaster struck immediately. The early model M16s, prone to jamming in the mud and grit, began to fail. Panic started to set in as the enemy, sensing weakness and lack of fire superiority, began to close in, their shouts audible over the gunfire. It was a moment that usually ended in a frantic call for artillery and a high casualty count. Then the Australians opened up. The sound was unlike anything the Viet Cong or the Americans had ever heard. It wasn't the high-pitched rattle of small-caliber fire. It was a deep, rhythmic thunder that physically shook the air. 3 Australians, armed with their modified .8, stepped forward and unleashed a wall of heavy lead. The sawed-off barrels created a muzzle flash the size of a basketball, blinding in the dim light, while the heavy 7.62mm rounds punched through trees, sandbags, and bodies with indifferent ease. The sheer violence of the counterattack was staggering. The enemy, convinced they had stumbled upon a heavy machine gun platoon rather than a handful of men, broke contact and fled in disarray, leaving their wounded behind. When the smoke cleared, the American lieutenant looked at the smoking, ugly, sawed-off weapon in the hands of an Australian corporal and asked what kind of hellish machine that was. The corporal just grinned, patted the hot metal, and said it was just a little insurance policy. But this engineering ingenuity was just one piece of the puzzle. While .9 provided the brute force to survive a firefight, the Australians had another trick up their sleeve to ensure they rarely got into one on the enemy's terms. It was a method that involved a different kind of sensory awareness. A method that relied on people the rest of the world had forgotten. The true secret weapon of the Australian forces was not a piece of technology listed on any army manifest, nor was it something that could be purchased with the massive American defense budget. The main trump card was a group of people whom the Americans did not even consider to be military specialists. These were men whom white Australia had kept as third-class citizens for decades, people whose children were often barred from attending regular schools and whose rights were trampled upon by the very government they now served. They were the Aborigines, the indigenous masters of the land. Sergeant Billy Ferguson of the Wiradjuri people, Corporal Johnny Moriko of the Yolngu tribe, and Private Harry Alinga of the Aranda. These names meant absolutely nothing to United States Command, but in the dense, suffocating green hell of the Vietnamese jungle, they meant more than millions of dollars worth of high-tech American reconnaissance equipment. Aboriginal trackers had served in the Australian Army since the First World War, and their ability to read the jungle seemed nothing short of supernatural to the uninitiated Western eye. They could determine how many people had passed a trail, exactly when they had passed, where they were headed, whether they carried heavy weapons, if they were wounded, or if they were moving in a hurry. All of this critical intelligence was gleaned from barely perceptible prints in the mud, broken twigs that no one else would notice, disturbed colonies of insects, or minute changes in the moisture of the soil. Captain Terence O'Farrell of Delta Force once watched in stunned silence as Billy Ferguson led an Australian patrol through the triple-canopy jungle of Bin Duong province. The Aborigine moved barefoot, completely ignoring the strict army regulations regarding footwear. Every 15 to 20 meters, he would stop, freeze for 30 to 40 seconds like a statue, listen to the wind, sniff the heavy air, and study the ground like a scholar reading an ancient text. 2 hours into the patrol, Ferguson raised a clenched fist, the universal silent signal to halt immediately. He pointed a dark finger ahead into what looked like an impenetrable wall of green vegetation. O'Farrell strained his eyes, but saw nothing except vines and leaves. An Australian lieutenant leaned in and whispered that there was an enemy camp 100 meters ahead, containing 25 to 30 men who had stopped for a day break. He claimed they were boiling rice, though there was no fire visible. The American captain sniffed the air frantically but smelled nothing except the rotting vegetation, damp earth, and his own nervous sweat. 20 minutes later, a 105mm battery struck the coordinates provided by the tracker. When the smoke cleared and the patrol moved in, they found 27 bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers, 3 82mm mortars, a radio station, and scattered maps. Ferguson had been right down to the last man. The American captain spent the next 3 days trying to process what he had witnessed, unable to comprehend how the tracker identified the camp from such a distance. The smell of boiling rice in a jungle that perpetually smells of rot seemed impossible to isolate, and the sound of boiling water from 100 meters away sounded like pure science fiction. When asked, Ferguson simply shrugged and explained that he felt the earth, that the land talked to him in a language the white man had forgotten. He told the captain that in heavy combat boots, a soldier is effectively deaf to the world beneath his feet. This moment was a turning point for many American officers who finally realized that while technology is powerful, there are ancient forms of knowledge that no military academy can teach. There is a primal connection to the land that no radar or thermal sensor can ever replace. The richest army in the world was losing the war to people who walked barefoot and read tracks in the dirt, and the Australians had tapped into that ancient power. But the use of indigenous trackers was only one element of a terrifyingly effective system. What the Australians did next to their own equipment was something the Americans initially refused to even recognize as a valid tactic, viewing it instead as a breach of discipline. They began to modify their standard issue gear in ways that violated every regulation in the logistics manual. They took their sturdy, heavy army boots and sliced off the heels and the backs, turning them into a kind of tactical sandal that offered no ankle support but provided maximum sensitivity. When a visiting American colonel first saw this, he turned red with rage and demanded an explanation from the Australian command, claiming that the men were destroying government property and that it was unsafe and unsanitary for the soldiers. The Australian major replied with a brutal honesty that silenced the room. He explained that a bare foot feels a stretched tripwire in the dark long before the eye can see it. A bare foot feels the hardness of a dry twig before it snaps and gives away a position to the enemy. A bare foot reads the ground and communicates with the brain instantly. Standard boots, he argued, turn a soldier into a blind, stumbling man who announces his arrival with every heavy step. But this adaptation was merely the beginning of their descent into the wild. The Australians did not just adapt to the jungle, they weaponized its deadliest inhabitants against their enemies. In a move that demonstrated a level of ingenuity bordering on sadism, they turned nature itself into a booby trap. This was the birth of the Cobra Trap, a tactic born of desperation and a lack of standard explosives. It happened during a deep penetration mission led by Sergeant Dundee, whose squad found themselves deep in enemy territory with their supply of Claymore mines exhausted. They needed to secure their rear flank against a pursuing Viet Cong unit, but they had nothing left that goes boom. While moving through a bamboo thicket, the point man froze. Directly in their path, coiled and angry, was a massive king cobra, over 3 meters long. A normal soldier would have shot it or moved around it. Dundee saw an opportunity. With terrifying calm, the squad pinned the deadly reptile using a forked stick, capturing the hissing, venomous creature alive. They took an empty cardboard ration box, carefully placed the enraged snake inside, and loosely taped it shut. They then placed the box in the middle of the narrow trail, disguised under a pile of loose leaves, and attached a thin, invisible fishing line to the lid, stretching it across the path at ankle height. It was a biological landmine, silent and terrifying. 2 hours later, the pursuing Viet Cong scout tripped the line. The lid flipped open. The cobra, agitated by hours of confinement and darkness, struck instantly. There was no explosion, no flash of light, only a sudden, wet thud and a horrific, gurgling scream that tore through the silence of the jungle. The victim took a full dose of neurotoxic venom directly to the face. The psychological effect on his comrades was devastating. Panic erupted instantly. Terrified by the unseen threat and the agonizing fate of their scout, the enemy unit opened wildfire into the surrounding jungle, spraying bullets at shadows and completely giving away their position to the Australian ambush team waiting ahead. The Australians didn't even have to return fire immediately. The jungle had done the work for them, turning a disciplined enemy unit into a chaotic mob. But even the horror of a cobra trap paled in comparison to the Australians' most potent weapon, a patience that defied human physiology. This was the spider doctrine, a level of stillness that American soldiers found physically impossible to replicate. The most famous example of this occurred during Operation Spider in Phuoc Thi Province in January 1967. A 6-man team under Captain Terry O'Hanlon was tasked with locating the elusive headquarters of the 3rd Regiment of the National Liberation Front. Intelligence reported the headquarters was somewhere near the village of Long Phuoc, but the exact coordinates were a mystery. The standard American approach would have been to bomb the entire district or send in a battalion to sweep the area, alerting the enemy miles away. The Australians decided to play a different game. O'Hanlon's group set out at dawn, moving like ghosts for 4 full days, averaging a mere 3 kilometers of travel per day. They crawled more than they walked. On the 5th day, their tracker pointed to a barely visible footpath intersected by another, slightly wider trail. It was a perfect ambush spot. The group took up positions 80 meters from the junction, camouflaged themselves with ferns and mud, and prepared to wait. They waited for 43 agonizing hours. This was 43 hours without a single movement. 43 hours without scratching an itch, changing posture, or flicking away a biting ant crawling across an eyelid. 43 hours of urinating in their pants because moving away to relieve oneself meant giving up the position and potentially alerting the enemy. American officers who were told this story later simply refused to believe it. They argued that human physiology does not allow a person to remain motionless for that long. Muscles would atrophy. Terrible cramps would set in, and the person would eventually lose consciousness or go insane from the strain. The Australians simply invited them to witness it for themselves. Lieutenant David Coleman of the 75th Ranger Regiment, a tough and capable officer, decided to test his own limits. He was dropped into the jungle with an Australian team with one simple task: observe the trail without giving himself away. Coleman lasted exactly 11 hours. Then, the psychological pressure broke him. He began to have a severe panic attack, overwhelmed by the sensation that he was buried alive, that the jungle was closing in to suffocate him. The Australian sergeant lying next to him didn't even turn his head to look. He just reached out a muddy hand, found the American's wrist, and squeezed it firmly until the shaking stopped. Coleman tried to pull himself together, but the mental dam had broken. 20 minutes later, he had to be evacuated by helicopter. The Australians stayed. They lay there in their own filth for another 32 hours, blending into the forest floor like fallen logs. At the end of the second day, a Viet Cong patrol passed by, 9 men armed with AK-47 rifles. The Australians didn't flinch. The enemy passed just 3 meters from their hidden position and noticed absolutely nothing. 4 hours later, a group of porters appeared carrying heavy supplies. One of them stopped and relieved himself 2 steps from where the Australian sergeant lay buried under the leaves. The warm spray hit the sergeant's arm. He did not move a muscle. He did not breathe. The porters left, unaware they had been standing next to 6 heavily armed men. The Australians kept waiting, their patience infinite. And then finally, the prize appeared. A North Vietnamese army officer in a crisp, clean uniform walked onto the trail, holding a folded map and escorted by 4 bodyguards. Even from a distance, it was clear this was a high-ranking commander. O'Hanlon's group froze, their fingers tightening on their triggers. To shoot or not to shoot? 5 targets, 6 shooters, 30 meters distance. It was a guaranteed elimination. But shots would reveal their position, and the opportunity to destroy the entire network would be lost. The captain made his decision in 3 seconds, observation only. The officer stood at the junction for 7 minutes, studying the map and pointing directions. The Australians memorized the route, noted the time, and recorded every detail of the conversation they could hear. 6 hours later, O'Hanlon's group slipped away silently, radioed in, and transmitted the coordinates. 12 hours later, United States aircraft struck the location. The 3rd Regiment lost its command staff, its communications hub, and its control over the province for 3 months. 43 hours of absolute immobility had achieved what 1,000 soldiers could not. This was not just warfare. It was a demonstration of a superior will. But this level of commitment came with a terrifying price tag. It was one thing to act like a ghost for a mission, but quite another to return to the world of the living afterwards. Gradually, it began to dawn on American command that they were dealing with men who had crossed a psychological line. General William Westmoreland personally requested permission to send U.S. officers for training, hoping to instill this discipline in his own ranks. 32 captains and majors underwent a 2-week survival course. 23 of them couldn't take it and asked to go back on the 3rd day. The demands were simply too high, the discipline too rigid, and the risk too great for men used to the comfort of massive fire support. One day, this superhuman patience transformed into a legend that is still whispered about in sniper schools from Quantico to Hereford, a story so impossible that it defies the laws of human endurance. It happened in the Longtan area in May 1968, during a week where the jungle heat was hot enough to boil the sweat on a man's skin. Australian Sniper Corporal Ian McLeod took a position that American manuals strictly forbade as suicidal. He climbed 18 meters up a massive teak tree, lashing himself to the thick branches like a leopard waiting for prey. American doctrine stated clearly that a sniper must have an escape route, and descending from a tree under fire is impossible. But McLeod was not planning on escaping. He was hunting a ghost. For a week, a North Vietnamese marksman had been systematically picking off Australian soldiers, a professional who fired once, changed position, and left absolutely no tracks. Intelligence pinpointed his general area, and McLeod decided to play the most dangerous game on Earth. He spent 36 hours in that tree. 36 hours suspended above the ground, with insects biting his face and the humidity soaking his camouflage. On the 2nd day, the North Vietnamese marksman finally appeared, slipping into a dense bamboo thicket exactly 120 meters from McLeod's perch. The 2 snipers were now in a direct line of sight of each other, locked in a silent duel where the first man to blink would lose his life. Both knew the rules. The first shot reveals the shooter, and if you miss, the return shot will be accurate and fatal. A terrifying game of endurance began. It was a game where the winner would be the one who stayed human longer, or perhaps the one who ceased to be human first. 7 hours passed in absolute silence. The Vietnamese soldier did not move a muscle. McLeod did not twitch. The Australian's only movement was a slow, millimeter-by-millimeter shift of his rifle scope to follow the sun, ensuring the glint of the glass wouldn't give away his position to the enemy. 2 hours later, a Viet Cong patrol of 8 men passed directly under McLeod's tree, talking and smoking, completely unaware that death was watching them from above. These were easy targets. Any average shooter would have dropped 3 of them in the first 3 seconds. McLeod did not fire. He froze his breath, his heart rate slowing to a crawl. He knew the North Vietnamese sniper was waiting for exactly that, for the Australian to open fire on the patrol and reveal his hiding spot. It was a trap, and McLeod refused to take the bait. The patrol left, fading into the green abyss. Night fell, bringing with it the pitch-black darkness of the tropics. McLeod spent a second night in the tree, lashed to the trunk with a rope so as not to fall if he drifted into a microsleep. At dawn on the 3rd day, the exhaustion finally claimed the enemy. The Vietnamese marksman made a single, fatal mistake. He shifted just a few centimeters to stretch a cramped leg in the bamboo. That was enough. McLeod saw the unnatural movement of a single leaf, locked his target, exhaled the last bit of air from his lungs, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy-caliber bullet covered 122 meters in 0.23 seconds. It entered the enemy's left temple before the sound of the shot even reached him. The threat was neutralized instantly. The story became a legend, and Colonel Hackworth later included it in training materials for United States snipers as the ultimate example of discipline. But when McLeod was later asked how he endured 36 hours in a tree without losing his mind, he answered with a chilling honesty. He said he didn't endure it. He just switched off the part of the brain responsible for humanity and switched on _17_. And when it was over, he couldn't switch the human back on right away. It took him 3 days to remember how to talk to people without assessing them as targets. But this was merely the physical cost of the war. What the Australians did next proved that they were willing to weaponize not just the jungle, but the very fabric of human sanity. If the sniper duel was a surgical strike, the next phase of their operations was a descent into psychological terror that bordered on the occult. This was the Ghost Village operation, a tactic that American PSYOPs teams would later study with a mixture of admiration and horror. It happened in a region where a local village was heavily suspected of supplying the Viet Cong with rice and information. Standard procedure would have been a cordon and search operation, kicking down doors, shouting and interrogating villagers. The Australians chose a path that was infinitely more sinister. They decided to break the enemy's will by exploiting their deepest cultural fears. In Vietnamese folklore, the souls of the departed who are not buried properly become, quote, 19 tormented spirits that haunt the living. The Australians decided to bring these ghosts to life. Under the cover of a moonless night, a team of SAS operators infiltrated the village. They did not carry rifles at the ready. They carried portable, battery-operated speakers and bags of specific props. They moved through the village while the inhabitants slept, slipping into huts like shadows. They didn't hurt anyone physically. Instead, they engaged in a campaign of psychological gaslighting that would drive a rational person to madness. Inside the huts of known sympathizers, they silently rearranged the furniture. A chair that was facing the door was turned to face the wall. A picture of an ancestor was flipped upside down. On the pillows of sleeping men, they placed the ace of spades, a known symbol of death, or specific local tokens that signified a curse. They moved with such terrifying silence that families slept through the invasion of their own homes, unaware that the enemy was standing inches from their faces. Then, just before dawn, the real terror began. The team retreated to the jungle edge and activated the speakers. They played a tape known as Ghost Tape Number 10. It was a professionally engineered recording featuring eerie, distorted Buddhist funeral music and the wailing voices of dead Viet Cong soldiers. The voices on the tape screamed in Vietnamese, crying out that they were trapped in hell, that they had died pointlessly, and warning the living to stop supporting the war lest they suffer the same fate. The sound echoed through the mist, seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The effect was apocalyptic. The villagers woke up to find their homes inexplicably altered by invisible hands, death marks on their beds, and the screams of the damned floating in the air. Panic is too soft a word for what ensued. It was a primal, spiritual terror. Entire families fled their homes, running into the dawn, convinced that their village had been cursed by angry spirits. By noon, the strategically important village was a ghost town. The Australians watched from the tree line, their mission accomplished without firing a single shot. One of the corporals was chuckling as he packed away the speaker, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the dry, hollow sound of a man who knows he has crossed a line. They had saved ammunition, yes, and they had neutralized the threat, but they had done it by tearing apart the psychological reality of hundreds of civilians. They were winning battles, but they were losing their connection to the civilized world with every successful operation. They were becoming the very monsters they were pretending to be. This constant immersion in fear, this manipulation of the darkest corners of the human psyche, began to take a toll that no amount of medals could ever repay. The transition from quote 24 back to quote 25 was becoming impossible. You cannot spend weeks convincing the world that you are a spirit of vengeance and then expect to go home and mow the lawn on a Sunday. The psychological wall between the soldier and the civilian was becoming a fortress, and this fortress was built on the foundation of traumas that were silently accumulating in the minds of these young men. The quote 26 operation was a tactical masterpiece, but it was also a clear signal that the war had moved beyond the physical realm into something far darker. It was this very darkness that would follow them home. The effectiveness of their methods was undeniable. The statistics were miraculous, but the human mind is not designed to operate in quote 27 indefinitely. The adrenaline fades, the mission ends. But the memories of the 0.23-second bullet flight and the wailing of the electronic ghosts do not simply vanish, they fester. And as the war dragged on, the invincible Australian SAS soldiers began to realize that their greatest enemy was not the North Vietnamese army, but the reflection they saw in the mirror every morning. That is the real price of efficiency, a price that is rarely calculated in military budgets or campaign medals. It was a psychological toll that no one liked to talk about, a shadow that followed these men long after the guns fell silent. Australian Vietnam veterans returned home as people their families simply did not recognize. Wives reported with terrifying consistency that their husbands would wake up in the middle of the night, eyes wide with a 1,000-yard stare, grab kitchen knives, and silently patrol the perimeter of their own suburban houses in Sydney or Melbourne. Children were afraid to enter their father's room without knocking loudly, because the instinctive reaction of a sleeping jungle fighter could be fatal even to a loved one. Many of these elite veterans could not sleep in soft beds. They slept on the hard floor, backs pressed firmly against the wall, facing the door, just as they had done in the mud of Phuoc Tuy. Some could not remain in enclosed spaces like elevators or cinemas for more than an hour without suffering severe panic attacks, their bodies reacting to a phantom threat that was no longer there. The rate of post-traumatic stress disorder among Australian Special Air Service soldiers exceeded 80%. For comparison, among United States infantry units, the rate was estimated at 30 to 40%. It was a staggering twofold difference that demanded an explanation. The reason was chillingly simple. American soldiers fought as soldiers. They returned to base, ate hot food, watched movies, and slept in relative safety behind wire and guards. Australian SAS fought like predators. They spent weeks and months deep in the jungle, completely disconnected from civilization, living like the animals they hunted. They became part of a hostile environment, and that environment changed them irreversibly. You cannot live like a wild animal for 2 weeks, relying on scent and instinct to survive, and then just return to society and be human again at the flip of a switch. The tragic story of Captain Bruce Price, a platoon commander, serves as a grim testament to this reality. After his third rotation, Price spent 4 months in a psychiatric clinic. He told doctors he could not stand the smell of commercial shampoo because in his mind it was associated with immediate danger. In the jungle, any chemical smell meant the enemy was near. He could not use elevators because enclosed spaces felt like Viet Cong tunnel traps. He could not be in a room with the lights on because years of night vision training made bright light physically painful to his retinas. Price lived for 32 years after the war, but he never truly returned to a normal life. He settled in the remote mountains of New South Wales in a house without electricity, without neighbors, and without roads. Once a month, he went to town for groceries, speaking to no one. The rest of the time was spent in absolute solitude. When he was found in 2007, it turned out he had passed away 4 days prior, but no one had noticed his absence. The jungle ghost had become a ghost in his own country. There were hundreds like Price. The Australian government refused to acknowledge the problem for a long time. Official statistics boasted that the Australian contingent in Vietnam showed outstanding efficiency with minimal losses. 521 passed away, 3,000 wounded. Brilliant figures on paper. But the statistics didn't account for those who ended their own lives a year after returning, or those who drank themselves into oblivion 5 years later, or those who simply vanished into the outback, severing all ties with humanity. By the early 2000s, when proper research finally began, it was revealed that the suicide rate among Special Forces veterans was triple that of regular servicemen. And then, something happened that the Pentagon kept quiet about for 30 years, because admitting it would have been a public humiliation for the world's greatest superpower. But there was another side to this story, a side the Pentagon didn't like to talk about because admission meant swallowing their immense pride. The Australian methods worked so effectively that American intelligence services began to copy them secretly without official credit, through front training programs and unranked consultants. They realized that while they had the watches, the Australians had the time. When Delta Force, the absolute elite of United States Special Operations, was created in 1977, its founder, Colonel Charlie Beckwith, quietly included several Australian instructors in the training program. Officially, they were invited as _30 unofficially, they taught Americans the very art that had once been the subject of mockery by Marine officers. By the early 1980s, these methods became the gold standard for all elite U.S. units. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Green Berets all adopted critical elements of the Australian doctrine. Long-range patrols in small groups, shedding excess gear to travel light, emphasizing silence and stealth over massive firepower, and using local trackers. Yet, recognition did not come immediately. It took another major war for American generals to publicly admit the truth. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, United States Special Forces conducted deep reconnaissance raids into Iraq, hunting for mobile Scud missile launchers in the vast desert. The tactics were almost a carbon copy of Australian patrols from Vietnam. Small groups, long-term presence behind enemy lines, total stealth, and strikes from ambush. The operations were commanded by General Wayne Downing, the same man who, as a young captain in 1968, had trained with the Australians and was one of the few Americans to complete their brutal full course. Downing openly admitted to journalists years later that everything they learned in Iraq, they stole from the Australians in Vietnam. He said it just took 20 years to realize it and swallow their pride. Then came Afghanistan in 2001. United States troops began operations in the mountains against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The landscape was different, not humid jungle, but dry mountains and deserts. Yet the principles remained identical. The enemy knows the terrain better than you. The enemy blends with the population, and the enemy uses guerrilla tactics. Once again, massive operations proved ineffective. Once again, small mobile groups capable of living in a hostile environment for weeks without support were needed. Once again, the Australian experience was remembered and revered. By this time, most Vietnam veterans were either gone or too old for active service. But their legacy lived on in the new generation. Australian Special Forces participated in the Afghan campaign from the start and again demonstrated impressive efficiency. In 2005, a group of 8 Australians in Uruzgan province engaged 150 Taliban fighters and held out for 9 hours until reinforcements arrived. The losses were 0 killed, 2 lightly wounded. The enemy lost 71 confirmed fighters. Same methods, same results. 40 years later, reporters asked the group commander how they survived against such overwhelming odds. He replied briefly that they did what they were taught back in the 60s. He said no one forgot the lessons. The journalists didn't understand which lessons he meant, but the commander didn't explain. Why bother? Those who needed to know already understood. But let's return to where we started, to the knife at the throat, to the moment everything changed. Forward Operating Base, Phuket, 1968. Captain McNamara, after that night, '32 operation where he woke up with steel against his neck, demanded more than just an explanation. He demanded proof that Americans were not inferior. Major Curran agreed to a challenge. He selected 10 of the best Marines from McNamara's unit and gave them a simple task: try to infiltrate the Australian base at Nui Dat that same night. The distance was 8 kilometers through the jungle. The perimeter was weaker than the American one, only 30 guards instead of 70. The 10 Marines set out at 9:30 in the evening, confident in their skills. They returned at 5:30 in the morning, all 10 of them, without a scratch. But they didn't complete the mission. In fact, they hadn't even come close. They couldn't even get near the base perimeter. Australian patrols detected them at a distance of 200 to 300 meters, switched on floodlights, and fired warning bursts before the Marines even knew they had been seen. A Marine sergeant answered honestly that they moved as quietly as they could, but the Australians still heard them, as if they had bats instead of people guarding the wire. Curran smirked. Because Australian sentries really did navigate in the dark like bats, by sounds a normal person wouldn't even perceive as significant. The rustle of a branch under a boot, the metallic click of a safety catch, the quiet breath of a man trying to be silent but still breathing louder than the jungle itself. Australians trained for months to develop this hearing, sitting in darkness until their ears adjusted to the microsounds of the forest. Americans relied on night vision devices and motion sensors that could be fooled or bypassed. Then McNamara asked the big question, the question that would define the rest of his life. He asked if Curran could teach his men. Curran shook his head and said they could teach the techniques, but asked if the Americans were ready to pay the price. He explained that it was not just a set of skills, it was a philosophy. It was a willingness to give up comfort, safety, and humanity for the sake of efficiency. Your soldiers, he said, have to want to become something else. Not just better soldiers, different creatures entirely. McNamara said he would try. The Australians sent Sergeant Kevin Mackenzie, a veteran of the Malayan Emergency, a man who had spent more time in the jungle than in cities. Mackenzie trained a group of 12 Marines for 3 weeks. The program was simple: survival, camouflage, patrolling, ambushes. No theory, only practice. The group lived in the jungle, ate what they found, moved at night, and slept during the day. Mackenzie didn't explain, advise, or criticize. He just did, and the Americans tried to replicate it. Out of 12 men, 5 passed the course, 7 broke, and these were the best of the best United States Marines. The others broke psychologically. 1 suffered heat stroke in the 2nd week and was evacuated. 2 refused to continue after Mackenzie forced them to spend a night in a hole covered with branches, 2 meters from a trail where a Viet Cong patrol passed. 3 simply said they couldn't live like that. The constant tension, the inability to relax, the feeling that you're turning into an animal. 1 added a phrase McNamara remembered his whole life. He said he didn't want to become like Mackenzie, even if it made him a better soldier, because he wouldn't be able to go home and live a normal life. Mackenzie nodded. He understood. He himself wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to return to a normal life. The 5 who passed the course went on real operations with Australian patrols. 3 passed away in the first 6 months, not from enemy fire, but because they tried to act like Australians without their years of ingrained experience. 1 went missing in the jungles of Quang Nam. His body was never found. The last one, Corporal James Henderson, rose to the rank of major, became an instructor at the Ranger School, and dedicated the rest of his career to teaching American soldiers what he had learned from the Australians. Henderson passed away in 2018 at the age of 73. His funeral was attended by 5 generations of United States Special Forces, everyone who had gone through his training program, and on his grave, they carved the epitaph he chose himself. Here lies a man who learned how to be a ghost, but forgot how to be a man. So what is the bottom line? What remains of this story besides graves and medals? The Australian method of jungle warfare was effective but destructive. It produced results no other army in the world could achieve, but it required sacrifices that are rarely spoken of publicly. Sacrifices not just of lives, but of psyche, humanity, and the ability to return to a peaceful existence. The Americans adopted these methods, but they adopted them gradually, selectively, and adapted them to their own conditions. They didn't copy the Australian approach entirely because they realized the price was too high. It is better to be slightly less effective, but keep your soldiers human. Still, the question remains, which is more important, victory or humanity? Can one justify methods that turn soldiers into killing machines if those methods save the lives of their comrades? Does an army have the right to demand such a sacrifice from its people? Australian veterans answered this question in different ways. Some said they did what was necessary and had no regrets. Others remained silent because they couldn't find the words. Still others admitted that if they had known what it would do to them, they would have refused, even if it meant tragedy in the first battle. But the fact remains, the Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved results that are still considered the benchmark for small unit efficiency in guerrilla warfare. A loss ratio of 1 to 129 is not propaganda, it is documented statistics. No other special forces unit in the Vietnam War came anywhere close to those numbers. And it all started with the smell of fish sauce, cut boots, and a knife to Captain McNamara's throat. The incident with Operation _36_ became a legend. It was told in every United States military academy for the next 30 years. But the true meaning of the story isn't that the Australians could infiltrate an American base unnoticed. It's that they did it not to show off, but to teach a lesson. A lesson that jungle warfare is not about technology or firepower. It's about the willingness to become part of a hostile environment. About the willingness to give up everything that makes you a civilized person. About the willingness to turn into a hunter who patiently tracks prey for weeks, waits for the perfect moment, and delivers one precise strike. The American Army learned that lesson, but it learned it slowly and at a high price. By the time Australian SAS methods were officially integrated into the training programs of elite U.S. units, the Vietnam War was over. Years had passed. Tens of thousands of American soldiers had passed away in battles that could have been avoided. Military analysts agree that if U.S. forces had used small group tactics and long-range patrols from the beginning of the war instead of massive, "37 operations, losses would have been 30 to 40% lower. 30 to 40% of 58,000 is roughly 20,000 lives. 20,000 young Americans who could have come home but didn't. Because pride wouldn't allow them to learn from allies who were few in number and lacked loud fame. Because the doctrine of fire superiority seemed more, quote, 38. Because it's easier to rely on bombers and artillery than to train soldiers for survival. History has no, quote, 39, but it has facts. And these 4 facts still haunt military historians. Fact 1 shattered all illusions of equality and losses. The Australian contingent of 8,000 men lost 521 killed over 9 years of war. The U.S. contingent of 500,000 lost 58,000 killed over 10 years. Fact 2 was even grimmer. Australian units controlled Phuoc Tuy Province, one of the most dangerous regions in South Vietnam, with minimal losses and maximum efficiency. U.S. units lost control of territories almost immediately after leaving. Fact 3. The Pentagon hid for nearly 40 years. After the war, it was the Australian methods that formed the basis for the training programs of modern special operations units worldwide. British SAS, American Delta, Israeli Sayeret Matkal, French 1st Marine Infantry Parachute Regiment, all studied and adapted the Australian experience in Vietnam. Fact 4 was the most unexpected admission. The Military Museum in Hanoi dedicated a separate hall to countering the Australian SAS. A plaque on the display reads, quote, 41. Now imagine Captain McNamara waking up with a knife to his throat that night in 1968. What flashed through his mind at that moment? Fear? Certainly. Humiliation? Yes. Anger? Probably. But also, realization. The realization that everything he had been taught, everything he believed in as a U.S. Marine officer, was insufficient. McNamara lived to be 87. He passed away in 2019. In his final years, he gave interviews to historians and journalists. And every time the conversation turned to that night, quote, 42, quote, operation, he repeated the same phrase, quote, 43, quote, that is the true meaning of this story. It's not that the Australians were better soldiers than the Americans. It's that they were willing to pay a price the Americans were not. The price of their own humanity. The price of their psychological health. The price of the possibility of returning to a normal life after the war. And that made them invincible in the jungles of Vietnam. But it also destroyed them as people. The American command, seeing this, made a choice. Quote, 44. Was it the right choice? History will show. But one thing is certain. Australian Vietnam veterans paid the price so that the next generations of special operations soldiers wouldn't repeat their mistakes. They showed what can be achieved if you go too far. And they showed why you shouldn't go that far, even if it brings victory. Because a victory bought at the cost of your own soul is not a victory. It is a curse you must live with until the end of your days.